Welcome to Glisso English. Real life stories.
Imagine you're 50 feet in the air, the wind is picking up, and your boss just told you to forget the harness because the crane rental expires in an hour. If you follow the rules, you go home with empty pockets. If you take the shortcut, you might not go home at all. In today's story, we're looking at a real-life dilemma many workers face, the safety shortcut. We'll follow Elias, a veteran builder who has to choose between his paycheck and his principles. Stick around because we're also going to break down the essential English phrases you need to navigate high-pressure workplace conflicts. Conflict at work is universal, but the words we use to handle it can make all the difference. Let's head to Chapter 1 and see how this shortcut begins.
The sun hadn't even cleared the horizon when the crew huddled near the trailer. The morning air in early March was a biting cold that seeped through thick canvas jackets. Site manager Miller stood on a plastic crate, his breath blooming in white clouds as he spoke. "Listen up. We are 6 hours behind on the south wing, and the crane rental is costing us a fortune." He didn't look anyone in the eye. He kept his gaze fixed on a clipboard that looked official and intimidating. "To move faster, we're skipping the secondary harness checks on the roof beams today," he announced flatly. A heavy silence fell over the group, the kind of silence that usually precedes a disaster. Elias felt a sharp coldness in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. He knew that skipping those checks saved 20 minutes a load, but it left the men exposed. "Miller, the wind is gusting at 20 knots, Elias said, his voice sounding thinner than he intended. Miller's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he locked onto Elias with a practiced predatory stare. "If you want to play safety inspector, Elias, you can do it at the unemployment office starting right now." The manager gestured toward the gate, where the morning traffic was already beginning to roar and hiss. "You speak up again, you'll lose your day's pay and your spot on this crew. Are we clear?" Elias looked at his weathered hands, thinking of the stack of unpaid bills sitting on his kitchen table. The crane engine roared to life, a mechanical beast demanding that the workday begin, regardless of the cost. The roar of the crane served as a constant, rhythmic reminder of the high stakes involved. Elias climbed the internal scaffolding, his movements heavy with a reluctance he couldn't quite shake. With every step upward, he thought about the envelope resting on his dresser back at the apartment. It was a final notice from the utility company, stamped in a red ink that seemed to glow in his mind. He reached the staging platform and looked out over the skeletal framework of the rising building. From this height, the city looked like a complex machine, indifferent to the individuals keeping it running. He saw Leo, a kid barely 20 years old, already balanced on a narrow joist without a lifeline. Leo gave a quick, nervous thumbs up, but Elias could see the slight tremor in the boy's gloved hands. The pressure to perform was a physical weight, pressing down on Elias's shoulders more than his tool belt. He calculated the math of his life. 8 hours of work equaled a week of groceries and a flickering heater. One slip, however, and those 8 hours would become the last thing he ever did for his family. He reached for a steel beam, the cold metal biting through his gloves, and felt a wave of nausea. The wind whistled through the open gaps of the structure, a lonely sound that mimicked a warning cry. Elias knew he was an expert, a man who had built half the skyline, yet he felt like a novice today. He watched Miller pacing on the ground far below, a small, angry figure checking a stopwatch constantly. The conflict was no longer about the heights or the wind, it was a battle between his stomach and his soul. He hooked his wrench to his belt and stepped out onto the beam, praying the wind would stay calm. The lunch whistle hadn't blown yet, but Elias found himself climbing back down the ladder. He found Miller standing near the blueprint table, nursing a steaming cup of black coffee. Elias wiped the grit from his face and stood his ground, ignoring the frantic pace of the machines. "Miller, I've been on iron for 15 years, and those beams are slick with morning dew," Elias began. He tried to keep his tone professional, the way a veteran speaks to a foreman he still wants to respect. "The kid, Leo, is shaking up there, and one bad gust is going to send someone into the concrete." Miller didn't even look up from his drawings. He just tapped his pencil against the plywood table. "I thought I made myself clear this morning, Elias," the manager said, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "We aren't running a school here. We are running a job site with a deadline that was due yesterday." Elias leaned in, his voice steady. "A deadline doesn't mean much if the site gets yellow-taped by the coroner." Miller finally looked up, and for a second Elias saw a flash of genuine, cold corporate panic in his eyes. "If I stop that crane, the developer pulls the contract, and then 40 men are out of work, not just you." He threw the rest of his coffee onto the dirt and pointed a muddy finger directly at Elias's chest. "Go back up and do your job, or walk out the gate and let the collection agencies handle your mail." The threat was surgical, hitting exactly where Miller knew Elias was most vulnerable and afraid. Elias looked at the gate, then back at the heights, realizing his experience was now being used against him. He was being paid to be a leader, but Miller was demanding that he be a silent, obedient ghost instead. He turned away without a word, the taste of copper and frustration thick in the back of his throat.
The mechanical whine of the crane pulley filled the air as the next massive beam rose toward the sky. Elias stood on the narrow walkway, watching the shadow of the steel pass over the trembling crew. The wind had shifted from a steady breeze to sharp, unpredictable gusts that rattled the loose plywood. He looked over at Leo, who was straddling a girder, his eyes wide and fixed on the swinging load. Without the safety harness checks, the rhythm of the site had become frantic and dangerously uncoordinated. Usually there was a language of hand signals and nods, a silent dance of men who trusted one another. Today, that trust was gone, replaced by a desperate rush to stay ahead of Miller's impatient stopwatch. Elias reached out to steady a guide rope, feeling the raw power of the wind fighting against the steel. "Watch the swing!" Elias shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the grinding roar of a nearby generator. He saw a connector bolt roll off the edge, falling silently until it vanished into the gray abyss below. Every man on the high iron was working with one hand for the job and one hand for their own life. The shortcut was supposed to save time, but the fear was actually slowing them down as they hesitated. Elias felt the vibration of the crane's movement through the soles of his boots, a deep, unsettling thrum. He realized that the fast day Miller promised was actually a slow-motion disaster waiting to happen. The crane operator, tucked away in his glass cab, couldn't see the sweat beaded on the workers' foreheads. A sudden, violent crack echoed through the site as a cable snapped taut under the strain of a lurching load. Elias gripped the cold railing, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs like a trapped bird. The beam tipped dangerously to the left, and for a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to tilt with it.
The beam groaned as it swung off center, the heavy steel acting like a giant pendulum in the sky. Leo gasped, his boots sliding on the damp metal as the shifting weight forced him to lean into the void. His hands clawed at the air for a fraction of a second before he managed to hug the freezing girder. The load missed his head by inches, the rush of air from the passing metal whipping his hair across his face. "Stop the line!" Elias roared, his voice finally breaking through the industrial din of the construction site. Down below, Miller signaled the crane operator to hold steady, but he didn't signal for a full shutdown. The beam hung there, shivering in the wind, a 10-ton threat suspended over the heads of the terrified crew. Leo remained frozen, his face the color of wet ash, his fingers locked in a death grip around the steel. Elias eased himself forward, moving with a calculated slowness that ignored the frantic pulse in his neck. "Don't look down, Leo," Elias commanded, his voice dropping to a low, grounding growl that cut through the fear. He reached the boy and grabbed the back of his heavy work vest, anchoring him to the solid upright. They sat there for a long minute, two figures perched on the edge of the world, ignored by the city below. Miller's voice came crackling over the radio, sounding annoyed rather than relieved at the narrow escape. "He's fine, Elias. Get that load unhooked and quit wasting my daylight. We have 3 more to go." Elias looked at Leo's shaking hands and then down at the manager, who hadn't moved from his safe spot. The near miss hadn't changed the plan, it had only made the manager more impatient to finish the evidence. The shortcut had almost claimed its first victim, and Elias realized the next mistake would be final. He helped Leo back to the staging platform, knowing that the silence of the crew was finally about to break. The lunch whistle blew, but no one headed for the taco truck parked outside the main gates. The crew gathered in the shadow of the equipment shed, their faces etched with a grim, dusty exhaustion. Leo sat on an upturned bucket, his head between his knees, still shivering from his brush with the edge. Elias cracked open a thermos, the steam rising into the cold air, but he didn't take a single sip. "He's going to kill one of us before the sun sets," a veteran named Mike muttered, staring at the ground. The men spoke in low tones, their eyes darting toward the trailer, where Miller was likely checking his charts. Elias listened as they talked about their rent, their kids' braces, and the car payments they couldn't miss. He realized the shortcut wasn't just about ignoring a harness, it was about the leverage of their poverty. Miller knew exactly how many dollars stood between these men and the sidewalk, and he used it like a whip. "We can't keep going like this," Elias said, his voice cutting through the defeatist mumbles of the group. "If Leo falls, Miller will have a new kid in that spot by Monday morning," Elias added, his eyes hardening. The men looked at each other, the reality of their replaceability sinking in deeper than the winter chill. They were skilled tradesmen, but today they were being treated like disposable parts in a broken machine. One worker argued that they should just finish the shift and complain to the union later that evening. "Later is too late for the man on the beam," Elias countered, standing up and closing his heavy thermos. He saw the fear in their eyes, but he also saw a spark of shared anger beginning to override the panic. The break ended, but the air felt different now, heavy with a collective tension that was ready to snap. Elias looked at the crane one last time, knowing the next conversation with Miller wouldn't be in private. Elias was heading back to the ladder when he saw a white sedan pull into the gravel lot. The man who stepped out wore a clean hard hat and a high-visibility vest that hadn't seen a day of work. Elias recognized him as the lead developer's assistant, a man who only appeared when a project was closing. He watched from behind a stack of lumber as Miller hurried over, his aggressive posture turning into a bow. "We'll be topped out by tonight," Miller promised, his voice loud enough to carry across the quiet yard. "The inspector won't see a single open seam when he arrives at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning," he added. Elias felt a cold realization settle in his gut. The rush wasn't about a budget or a crane rental at all. Miller had cut a deal to hide structural shortcuts before the official city safety audit could take place. The harness rule was just the tip of the iceberg. The entire south wing was being finished with lies.
If they finished today, the evidence of their dangerous, hurried work would be sealed behind drywall forever. Elias looked at his crew, seeing them not as workers, but as witnesses to a crime they were being forced to commit. He understood now why Miller was so desperate to fire anyone who dared to ask a single honest question. The money Elias needed so badly suddenly felt like a bribe to keep him quiet about a future tragedy. He thought about the families who would eventually live or work in this building, trusting its integrity. His debt felt heavy, but the weight of a potential collapse felt like a mountain he couldn't carry. The moral pivot wasn't a slow turn, it was a sudden, sharp snap in his mind that changed everything. He walked toward the crane, not to climb it, but to find the kill switch that lived at its base. He wasn't just protecting his own life anymore. He was protecting the lives of people he would never meet.
The crane operator swung the next beam into position, the steel groaning as it hovered over the open deck. Miller stood near the edge of the pit, shouting into his radio for the connectors to move into the zone. Elias didn't climb the ladder. Instead, he walked directly into the center of the drop area and stopped. He raised both arms over his head, crossing them in the universal signal for an emergency all stop. The crane operator, confused by the sudden change in command, eased off the throttle and braked the load. "What are you doing?" Miller's voice boomed from the ground, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. He charged toward Elias, his boots kicking up clouds of gray dust as he ignored his own safety perimeter. "I told you to get on that beam or get off my sight. You're finished, Elias. You're fired," Miller screamed. Elias didn't flinch. He stood like a pillar of stone while the 10-ton beam swayed rhythmically above him. "This is a safety stand-down," Elias declared, his voice carrying a calm authority that silenced the nearby saws. "The wind is out of spec, the harnesses are sidelined, and we aren't moving another inch of steel today." Miller reached out to grab Elias's arm, but he stopped when he saw the rest of the crew looking down. Up on the scaffolding, the men had stopped hammering. They were watching the confrontation with bated breath. "You think you're a hero?" Miller hissed, leaning in close. "You just cost yourself every cent of your paycheck." "I'd rather have an empty pocket than a dead man on my conscience," Elias replied, looking Miller in the eye. He knew the mortgage was due and the lights might go out, but for the first time in weeks, he breathed easily. The standoff held for a long, agonizing minute as the shadow of the suspended beam stretched across the dirt. Elias had made his move, and now he waited to see if he would be standing in that dust all by himself.
The silence that followed Elias's declaration was louder than the roar of the machinery had ever been. Miller looked up at the skeletal heights, expecting to see the work continue despite the drama below. Instead, he saw Leo unclip his tool belt and take a seat on the edge of a steady interior platform. One by one, the other veterans followed suit, their hammers falling silent against the steel backdrop. Mike, the man who had worried most about his car payment, simply crossed his arms and looked down. The crane operator, seeing the entire crew effectively on strike, pulled the lever to lock the drum. The engine idled down to a low hum, leaving the site feeling ghost-like and unnervingly peaceful. "You're all finished!" Miller screamed, his voice cracking as he spun in a desperate, angry circle. "I'll have a new crew here by sunset. You won't get a reference. You'll never work in this city again." Elias didn't move from the center of the zone. He just watched as the men began to climb down. They didn't walk toward the gate. They walked toward Elias, forming a ragged line in the dusty dirt. Miller realized in that moment that his power to threaten was based entirely on their individual fear. Standing together, the threat of losing a day's pay became a shared burden rather than a lonely disaster. The developer's assistant in the white sedan watched the scene with a growing, nervous look of concern. He knew that a single fired worker was a nuisance, but a full-site walkout was a legal and PR nightmare. Miller's face went from purple to a pale, sickly gray as he realized he had lost control of the narrative. The domino effect had been triggered, and no amount of shouting could put the pieces back together. Elias felt a hand on his shoulder and looked over to see Leo standing beside him, his shaking finally gone.
The following morning, the site was eerily quiet, stripped of the usual frantic clatter of the crane. A fleet of black SUVs pulled into the gravel lot, and out stepped the city's chief building inspector. Miller was nowhere to be seen. Rumors swirled that he had been escorted off the property at dawn. Elias stood by the equipment shed, his hands deep in his pockets as he watched the inspectors work. They found the faulty bolts, the skipped welds, and the lack of safety logs for the high wire beams. The developer's assistant approached Elias, handing him a thin envelope that felt heavier than lead. "Your pay for yesterday," the man said, his voice clipped and professional, "and a bonus for the delay." He opened it to find a check that covered his utility bill and the rent he had been so afraid of. He realized that while he had risked everything, the company was now desperate to buy his silence. "Keep the bonus," Elias said, sliding the extra check back. "Just make sure the beams are bolted right." He looked up at the south wing, where a new foreman was already overseeing the harness checks. Leo was up there, safely tethered this time, his movements confident and his footing finally secure. The paper trail Elias had started would ensure that this building stood long after they were all gone. He walked toward the gate, feeling the sun on his face and a strange, light sensation in his chest. He had lost a day of work, but he had gained a reputation that no manager could ever take away. The story of the safety shortcut became a legend on the docks and the high iron for years to come. Elias headed home, knowing that for the first time in a month he could look in the mirror and smile. The crane began to roar again, but this time the sound didn't feel like a threat. It felt like progress.
The echoes of the crane eventually faded into the city's permanent hum, but the lesson remained etched in the steel. Elias didn't become a millionaire that day, and he still had to work the next Monday to keep his head above water. However, when he walked past that finished building years later, he didn't see a monument to corporate greed or a crunch day deadline. He saw a structure that was safe for the families inside because one man decided his dignity was worth more than a day's pay. The shortcut had been offered, the threat had been made, but the integrity of the crew had held stronger than any weld. In the end, Elias learned that the most important thing you build on a job site isn't the skyscraper, it's your own character. Elias's choice wasn't easy. In the real world, standing up to a boss like Miller can feel like jumping without a net. But as we saw, when the domino effect kicks in and a crew stands together, the power dynamic shifts. Safety isn't just a rule in a handbook, it's a right that every worker carries onto the site. Before you go, let's do a quick recap of the English we covered today. We talked about cutting corners, taking dangerous shortcuts. We looked at a safety stand-down, the act of stopping work to fix a hazard. And we saw what happens when someone is in a bind, stuck between a paycheck and their principles. Which of these situations have you encountered in your own career? I want to hear from you. Have you ever been told to ignore a rule to move faster? How did you handle it? Leave a comment below using one of today's vocabulary words. It's the best way to practice your English and share your experience with the Glisso community.
And don't forget to test yourself with the quiz below the description box. If this story helped you improve your English or gave you a new perspective on workplace ethics, hit that like button and subscribe. We have more stories to tell, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you on the next story. Goodbye.